The 5 battleships hung over the cinder world of Marin Toll like 5 iron suns, and not one of their masters had ever once said the word fear. Harold Osveth stood at the long window of the pavilion deck and counted them again, because counting was the only thing that ever quieted his hands. He was not a fighter. He had never fired a lance in his 90 seasons. He was a namer of ships, a keeper of the boasts, the small gray clerk whose whole life was writing down the great deeds of greater beings so that the rest of the galaxy would remember them in the right order. He counted the 5 hulls, and he wrote the count in his ledger, and his hands did not quiet at all. The gathering was called the Reckoning Muster. Once every 40 years the 5 proud powers of the Karn Reach brought their finest battleships to the dead world of Marin Toll and showed them to one another. It was not a war. It was worse than a war, in its way. It was a contest of pride, and pride in the Karn Reach was the only currency that never lost its worth. Osveth had served the muster for 60 years. He had written the names of 300 warships into the long ledger. He had heard 10,000 boasts, and in all that time, no power outside the 5 had ever dared to come. This year, one had. The hail had arrived 11 hours ago, on an open channel, in plain trade speech, with no threat in it at all. A single ship, the message said, asking leave to attend the muster as a guest. It came from the small gray edge of the map where the humans lived, that quiet species nobody had bothered to conquer because there had never seemed to be any reason to. The 5 powers had laughed. Of course they had laughed. And then, because pride is a thing that loves an audience, they had granted the leave, and told the human ship to come and stand among real warships and learn its place. Osveth had written that down too. He had a feeling, even then, that he was writing the first line of something he would not be able to stop. He had been a herald long enough to know the difference between the things you record and the things that record you. Most of what crossed the pavilion deck was the first kind: deeds to be filed, boasts to be weighed, craters to be measured and forgotten. But once or twice in a long life, a herald felt the cold turn in the air that meant the second kind had arrived, the kind of day that does not go into your ledger so much as it writes you into its own. And from the moment the human hail came in on that open channel, plain and unafraid and asking for nothing, the old gray clerk had felt the cold turn, and he had not been able to make it stop. The other heralds laughed when he said so. There were 3 of them on the pavilion deck, junior to him, young in the office, and they had never seen a muster end in anything but a louder boast than the last. They told Osveth he had grown soft with age, that a single gray ship from the quiet edge of the map could no more trouble the 5 powers than a moth could trouble a furnace. They were not unkind about it. They simply did not feel the cold turn, because they had not yet recorded enough boasts to know how every one of them ended. Osveth let them laugh. He had learned, across 60 years, that the herald's curse is to see the shape of a thing before anyone else, and to be believed by no one until the shape arrives. So he said no more, and he kept his counting, and he watched the dark beyond the 5 iron suns, and he waited. He looked at the 5 battleships, and he made himself say their names in his head, the way a herald must, with the proper weight. First was the Ruin of Velt, flagship of the Velthari, a slab of black metal 9 kilometers long, studded with so many gun towers that from a distance it looked furred. The Velthari built for mass. The Ruin of Velt could throw 40,000 shells in a single breath, and had once flattened a moon for the crime of holding a rebel garrison. Its master, Warlord Tankor, wore the melted slag of that moon as a ring. Second was the gilded spear of the Ossen throne, a needle of white and gold 30 kilometers long and barely a kilometer wide, faster than anything in the Reach, built to run a target down across a whole system and put one impossible shot through its heart. The Osan called it the kindest of their ships, because it killed before you knew you were dying. Third was the Choir, the dreadnought of the Sael, who did not fight with metal at all, but with sound and signal, a ship that sang into the minds of its enemies until their own crews opened the airlocks. The Sael did not count the dead. They counted the silenced. Fourth was the unbroken wall of Dreno, a fortress ship so heavily armored that in 2,000 years nothing had ever put a mark on its hull. It did not run, and it did not dodge. It simply arrived, and endured, and was still there when everything that had shot at it was gone. Fifth was the Hollow Crown, the predator ship of the Marauders, who took no worlds and held no throne, and lived only to hunt the strong. They did not boast of cities burned. They boasted of warships killed, one by one, in single combat, and their hull was scarred with the marks of 300 kills they had carved there themselves. 5 battleships, 5 powers, 60,000 years of war between them, and not one of them had ever been made to kneel. And into that, a single gray human ship was about to fly. Osveth closed his ledger and pressed his hand flat against the cold window, and watched the dark beyond the 5 iron suns, and waited to write down the joke that was about to arrive. He did not know yet that the humans did not boast. He did not know that this was the whole of the danger. In the Karn Reach, a warship was a sentence spoken aloud. The Velthari said mass, the Osan said speed, the Sile said silence, the Dreno said endurance, the Is said the hunt. Each power had spent its whole history shouting one word louder than the others, and the size of a ship was the size of the shout. A great warship, in the Reach, was a thing that wanted very badly to be seen. So when the human ship finally came, and the 5 masters leaned toward their windows to laugh at it, the first thing that troubled Osveth was that he could not see it at all. The sensors found it. The eyes did not. It sat exactly where the hail said it would, 11,000 kilometers off the muster line, and the instruments drew a shape there, long and smooth and dark, but the eye slid off it the way a hand slides off wet glass. It did not shine. It did not bristle. It threw back no light and made no boast and carried, as far as any scan could tell, no banner and no name painted anywhere on its hull. The 5 masters waited for it to announce itself. That was the custom. A ship arriving at the muster declared its name and its deeds so the herald could write them down. The human ship said nothing. It simply came and took the place it had been given at the far edge of the line and went quiet, like a guest who has been seated at a loud table and decides to listen. Osveth opened his ledger again. His pen hovered over the blank line where the new ship's name should go. He waited a long time. The line stayed blank. And somewhere in the gray clerk's chest, where 60 years of boasts had stacked up like cordwood, a very old and very quiet voice said, "This one is different. This one did not come to be remembered. This one came to remember you." The first boast came an hour later, and it came, as it always did, from Warlord Tankor of the Velthari. His voice filled the open channel like water filling a low room. He spoke to the human ship, but he spoke for all of them, the way the loudest always does. He told the gray hull at the edge of the line what it had flown into. He told it that the ruin of Velt carried more guns than the human world held people. He told it that the last species who came uninvited to the Reach was now a belt of dust around a cold star, and that the Velthari had named the dust after the joke it had been. He told it that the kindest thing the 5 powers could do for a guest so small was let it leave before the real ships woke up. Then he waited for the human ship to answer, and to boast back, because that was how it was done. You were given an insult, and you returned a greater one, and the herald wrote both down, and the contest had begun. The human ship did not boast back. It said, in plain trade speech, in a voice that was calm and unhurried, and somehow very tired, that it had heard the warlord, and that it understood, and that it thanked him for the welcome. It said it had come only to watch the muster, and that it would take no part in the contest of boasts, because its people did not keep that custom. It said it hoped the 5 powers would forgive a quiet guest. And then it went silent again. Osveth had heard 10,000 boasts in 60 years. He had never once heard a ship decline to make one. On the 5 flagships, he could feel the confusion ripple out like a dropped stone. A boast refused was not humility, in the Reach. It could only be one of 2 things. It was cowardice, the soft belly of a creature that knew it could not win the contest of words, or it was something else, something the 5 powers had no word for, because nothing in their 60,000 years of pride had ever needed one. Tancor decided it was cowardice. Of course he did. Pride always reaches for the answer that costs it nothing. He laughed, and the 4 other masters laughed with him, the laughter passing flagship to flagship along the open channel until the whole muster line shook with it. They named the human ship the Quiet One, and they meant it the way you name a small dog. They told it to stay at the edge and watch how real warships spoke to one another, and to learn, before it crawled home, what greatness sounded like. Osveth wrote the name down. The Quiet One. It was the only name the human ship would let anyone give it. He looked at the blank line above it, where the ship's true name should have gone, and for the first time in 60 years, the herald felt something cold move through the part of him that kept the records. Because he had noticed a thing the 5 masters, drunk on their own laughter, had not. When the warlord had spoken his boast, every instrument on the pavilion deck had reached out to measure the ruin of Velt, the way instruments do when a great thing speaks, and they had drawn its shape in full. 9 kilometers, 40,000 guns, a reactor signature like a small star. The herald had seen those numbers 100 times. They were enormous. They were meant to be seen. But when the human ship had spoken its quiet, tired answer, the instruments had reached for it too. And they had come back with almost nothing. A long, dark shape, a surface that drank every scan, a power signature so low and so flat that the machines had at first marked the ship as cold, as drifting, as a hull with the lights gone out. The herald had served warships his whole life. He knew the one thing every fighter in the Reach agreed on, the one truth under all the boasts. A weak ship hides what little it has, and prays you do not look. A strong ship shows everything it has, because the showing is the weapon. But the ship at the edge of the line was not hiding what it had. It was hiding how much. And there was only one kind of creature that bothered to hide how much it carried. The kind that had so much it had learned to be ashamed of frightening people by accident. Osveth closed the ledger. He did not write that thought down. Some thoughts a herald keeps off the page until he is sure, and some he keeps off the page because he is afraid that writing them makes them true. He looked at the Quiet One, sitting small and dark and patient at the far edge of the loudest gathering in the Reach, and he understood, in the cold, quiet place under all his counting, that the joke was not the human ship. The joke was everyone laughing at it, and the punchline had not arrived yet. The night before the contest, Osveth could not sleep, and so he did what an old clerk does when the mind will not be still. He went back through the long ledger. He turned the brittle pages by the dim light of the pavilion deck, 60 years of his own steady hand, and he read the boasts of warships long since broken into scrap. He read the boast of the Sun-Eater of the old Velthari line, 3 centuries gone, which had sworn no hull in the galaxy could survive its fire, and which had died screaming when a smaller, hungrier ship found the one angle its 40,000 guns could not cover. He read the boast of the Edge of Heaven, an Osan needle even prouder than the gilded spear, which had been so fast and so perfect that it had run itself straight into a trap laid by a slower mind that had simply waited for its pride to put it in range. He read 100 boasts, and he saw the pattern that only a herald sees, the pattern that the proud never see because they are too busy being proud. Every warship in the ledger had been the greatest in the sky, right up until it wasn't. Every single one had measured itself against the wrong question. They had asked, how loud am I, how large, how fast, how feared, and never once had any of them asked the question that the herald, turning those brittle pages in the dark, found himself asking now about the silent gray ship at the edge of the line. Not how loud is it, how old is it, how much has it already broken, and grieved, and learned, before it ever arrived at my table. He closed the ledger near dawn, and sat with it on his lap, and he thought about the Quiet One sitting out there in the dark, and he understood that he had been reading the wrong book to find the answer. The answer was not in the ledger of boasts. The answer was in the one thing the human ship had refused to do, which was add itself to that ledger at all. A warship that wants to be in the book of boasts is a warship that still has something to prove. A warship that declines the book is a warship that proved it a long time ago, somewhere the herald would never see, against something the herald hoped he would never meet. The contest of boasts began in earnest the next morning, and the five powers spent it the way they always did, by hurting the dead world below them. This was the heart of the reckoning muster. A dead world had no people on it to mourn, and so the five battleships used Marin Toll as a stage. Each power would do something terrible to the Cinder world, something only a great warship could do, and the others would watch, and the herald would write it in the ledger, and the doing of the terrible thing was the boast made flesh. Words were for the welcome. The muster proper was spoken in craters. Osveth stood at the window with his pen ready and watched the Velthari go first. The ruin of Velt did not aim. That was the point of it. Tankor opened a tenth of his gun towers, 4,000 of them, and fired them all at once into the northern face of Marin Toll, and the herald watched a continent the size of an ocean simply cease to be a thing with a shape. The light of it washed the pavilion deck white. When it cleared, there was a glowing wound in the dead world 400 kilometers across, and the ruin of Velt had not so much as warmed its hull. 40,000 shells in the magazine still. This had been a cough. The four other masters made the sounds that pride makes when it is impressed and refuses to admit it. Tankor wore his slag ring and said nothing, which was its own kind of boast. The herald wrote it down. 4,000 towers, 400 kilometers, a tenth of the ship. He underlined the tenth, because the tenth was the threat. Look how little I used, the underline said. Look what is left. Then the herald did a thing he had started doing only that morning. A small thing, a clerk's thing. He looked at the human ship. The quiet one sat at the edge of the line where it had been put. It had watched a continent die. It had not moved, and it had not spoken, and its power signature on the instruments had not flickered by a single degree. A continent had been unmade in front of it, and the dark gray ship had simply watched, the way a very old person watches children break things, with a patience that was almost kind and not kind at all. Osveth wrote, "The guest did not flinch." Then he scratched it out, because it was not a deed, and the ledger was for deeds. But he remembered it. A herald remembers what he scratches out. The Osan went second, and the Osan went fast. The gilded spear did not destroy a continent. The Osan thought the Velthari crude, all that mass, all that waste. The gilded spear placed a single shot. Its master, the throne speaker Kalis, chose a mountain on the far southern pole of Marin Toll, a peak so distant that the light leaving it took most of a second to cross to the muster line, and she put one lance through the exact center of it from 30,000 kilometers away, while her ship was moving at a speed that turned the stars to lines. The mountain came apart in a ring so perfect it looked drawn. One shot, one mountain, no second needed. The boast of the Osan was not power, it was precision, and the contempt that comes with it. "We do not flatten your world," the gilded spear said with its single perfect ring. "We choose which part of you to end, and we are never wrong." Kalis turned the channel toward the human ship after that, the way a duelist turns to the crowd, and asked the quiet one whether it could even see the mountain she had killed, all the way out there at the soft gray edge where it cowered. The human ship answered. It said yes. It said it had seen the shot, and the mountain, and the moving, and it called the shot beautiful, and it meant it. The herald could hear that it meant it. It said the Osan had a steady hand, and then it said nothing more, and made no boast of its own, and Kalis, who had wanted a duel, was left holding a compliment she did not know how to fight. The herald wrote that down too, and his pen, he noticed, was not quite steady, because a thing was beginning to gnaw at the small gray clerk, down where the counting lived. The five powers were boasting at the human ship. They had been boasting at it for a full day. They had killed a continent and a mountain to make it afraid, and the human ship kept answering them as if they were the ones it had come to reassure. Steady hand, beautiful shot. It spoke to the most fearsome warships in the Reach, the way a grandfather speaks to grandchildren showing off, with a warmth that had something terrible folded up inside it, because the warmth could only come from one place. You are not warm toward a thing you fear, you are warm toward a thing you are sorry for. The human ship was being kind to them, And kindness, the herald thought. Kindness from a guest that hides how much it carries. That is not the sound of weakness. That is the sound of a fully grown thing trying very hard not to step on something small. Between the second boast and the third, there was a pause, and in the pause the five masters did the thing the powerful do when a guest will not play their game. They talked about it, on a closed channel, not knowing the herald could hear. A herald could always hear. That was the whole of the office. The five powers spoke their private words on a band they thought was sealed, but the pavilion deck heard all bands, because a record that only catches the boasts and misses the whispers is no record at all. So Osveth listened, with his pen down and his old heart beating slow, while the five proudest beings in the Reach argued about what to do with a small gray ship that would not be afraid. Tankor wanted to destroy it and be done. A guest that will not boast, he said, is a guest that mocks the table by being at it. The Velthari way was simple. A thing that troubles you, you unmake, and you do not lose sleep. Kalis of the Asan disagreed, and her reasons made the herald's skin go cold, because they were the reasons of a mind that was actually thinking. She said a ship that hides how much power it carries is either bluffing or it is not, and that the Velthari plan to fire on it would answer that question in the only way that mattered. If it was bluffing, the firing would end it, and good. But if it was not bluffing, Kalis said, then firing on it would be the single most expensive mistake any of them had ever made, because you do not learn the true size of a quiet thing by poking it. You learn it, and then you are inside it. The conductor of the sail said the cleanest thing of all. It said, "It does not feel like prey." The sail lived by the smell of fear, by the texture of a mind that can be opened, and the conductor said that when it reached its senses toward the human ship, it felt nothing it knew how to use. No soft place, no panic, no pride even, only a great calm patience that the sail had encountered exactly once before, long ago, in a thing it had been very glad to leave alive. Anchor Lord Brel of the Dreno said almost nothing, which from Brel was a speech. He said only, "Let it leave when it wishes." And the Reaver Prime, the Predator, said the opposite, said that a thing this strange must be tested, or it would haunt the Reach forever, that a hunter cannot let a question walk out of its sky alive, and that if no one else had the spine to make the human ship show its teeth, the Is would. The herald listened to all of it, and he understood that the five powers had already, in that closed and secret talk, divided themselves into the two halves that every meeting with a greater thing divides a people into. There were the ones who wanted to attack it, because they could not bear a question they could not answer. And there were the ones who wanted to let it be, because some old instinct deeper than pride had already whispered the answer to them, and the answer was, "That is bigger than you, and the bigger a thing is, the less you want to be the one who made it angry." The herald wrote, in his margin, the names sorted into their two halves, and he did not yet know which half would win, and he was afraid, listening, that the half that wins these arguments is almost always the loud one. The sail went third, and the sail did not touch the world at all. The choir was a dreadnought of sound and signal, and its boast was to take a mind and break it open and let the others watch. The sail had brought, for the muster, a single captured enemy, a war prisoner from some recent campaign, kept alive in a cell deep in the choir for exactly this. They put the prisoner's mind on the open channel so all five powers and the herald could feel it, and then the choir began to sing, a sound below sound, a pressure that crawled in under thought, and in 11 minutes the prisoner's mind came apart like wet paper, and at the end of it the prisoner opened its own cell and walked out an airlock with a smile on its face, because the choir had made the cold dark look like a mother. That was the Sael boast. "We do not need to break your hull. We will make your crew break it for us. We will make you want to die, and thank us, and call the airlock home." The choir's master, a cold soft voice that called itself only the conductor, turned its song, gently, toward the human ship. Just a touch, a taste, a single thread of the sound, the way you flick a finger against glass to hear if it will ring. And the herald, watching his instruments, saw the only thing that happened all day that the five masters did not. The thread of song reached the quiet one. It touched the dark gray hull. And it stopped. It did not bend. It did not scatter. It did not echo. It simply ended at the surface of the human ship, the way a sound ends at the bottom of a deep well, swallowed, with no return, as if the ship were not a thing the song could enter, because there was nothing inside it that could be made afraid. The conductor flicked its finger against the glass, and the glass did not ring. For the first time, the sail master went quiet, and it was a different quiet than before. The human ship spoke once more, and its voice was still calm, and still tired, and still kind, and it said, "Please do not sing to my crew." It said it understood that the song was a boast and not an attack, and it took no offense, but it asked, plainly, the way you ask a child to put down a sharp thing, that the choir not do that again. There was no threat in it. There did not need to be. The herald had served warships his whole life, and he knew the sound of a request that is also the last warning a thing will ever give, because the thing is too large to need to make a second one. The conductor did not sing again. Osveth wrote nothing in the ledger for a long moment. Then he wrote, in the smallest hand he owned, off in the margin where the deeds did not go, the song could not get in, and he stared at those 5 words, and he understood that he had just written down the single most frightening thing he had recorded in 60 years, and that not one of the 5 masters had even noticed it had happened. The Dreno went forth, and the Dreno did the opposite of everyone. The unbroken wall of Dreno did not attack, it defended. That was its whole nature and its whole pride. Its master, a slow old creature called Anchor Lord Brel, invited the other 4 powers to fire on the wall, all of them, at once, as hard as they liked, and the Dreno would simply stand there in the open and take it, and at the end, the wall would be unmarked, as it had been unmarked for 2,000 years. So they did. The ruin of Velt threw 1,000 shells. The gilded spear put 3 perfect lances into the same point to test the armor. The hollow crown raked it with predator fire, and the unbroken wall of Dreno took all of it standing still, and when the firing stopped, the wall was scarred and scorched and glowing in 9 places, but its hull was whole, and Anchor Lord Brel's slow old voice said, as it always said, that the wall had never been broken and never would be, and that the human ship at the edge of the line should look long at what real armor was, because the gray thing out there looked thin enough to put a finger through. The herald looked at the glowing scars on the unbroken wall. Then he looked at the human ship, which had taken nothing, because no one had fired on it, and he found himself doing a thing a herald is never supposed to do. He found himself wishing, with a cold, tight feeling in his chest, that someone would. He found himself wanting, very badly, to know what the gray hull would look like after 1,000 shells, and 3 perfect lances, and the rake of a predator's fire. He had a feeling it would look exactly the same as it did now. He had a feeling that was the entire reason it had no marks on it at all. The Is Marauders went last, and the Is Marauders did not waste their boast on a dead world. The Hollow Crown was a predator, and a predator does not boast about killing mountains. It boasts about killing hunters. Its master was a lean, scarred thing called the Reaver Prime, and its whole hull was carved with the 300 warships it had taken down in single combat, name after name after name cut into the metal, a graveyard worn as armor. The Reaver Prime did not do anything to Marin Toll. It simply turned the Hollow Crown to face the human ship, fully, openly, the way a predator turns to face the only thing in the room worth its time, and it spoke a challenge. It said it had killed 300 warships, and it had never once met one that ran from a fair fight. It said the 4 other powers could play with dead rocks all they liked, but a warship was a thing that fought, and a thing that would not fight was not a warship at all but a coward wearing a hull. It told the quiet one to stop hiding behind its kindness. It dared the human ship to fire. One shot, any shot, at anything. So the Reach could see whether the gray guest was a warrior or a ghost. And the whole muster line went still, all 5 powers waiting, because the Reaver Prime had finally asked the question the herald had been circling for 2 days. The human ship was quiet for 11 seconds. The herald counted them. He counted them because he could feel, in the marrow of his old gray body, that they were the most important 11 seconds of his life. and that everything before them had been the long, slow walk up to a door, and everything after would be on the other side of it. Then the Quiet One answered the Predator. It said it would not fire at a dead world, because the dead deserved better than to be a stage. It said it would not fire at the 5 battleships, because they were guests at the same table, and it had not come to break the table. It said it understood that the Reaver Prime wanted to see what it was, and it said, with that same tired, terrible kindness, that it would show them, not a shot, not a kill, just a single small true thing, so the 5 proud powers of the Karn Reach could stop wondering, and go home, and let the muster end in peace. It asked them, please, to watch the moon. There was a moon over Marin Toll, a small dead gray moon, airless and cratered, that had circled the Cinder World since before any of the 5 powers had a name. It was nothing. No one had even thought to put it in the ledger. It was scenery. The human ship asked the 5 battleships to watch the moon, and then it did the thing that the Herald would spend the rest of his life trying to find the right words for, and never quite would. It did not fire on the moon. It turned the moon off. The Herald did not have a better word. Then or ever. There was no flash. There was no beam. There was no sound, because there is never sound in the dark. The human ship simply did something the instruments could not draw because the instruments had no shape for it, and the small gray moon over Marin Toll came apart, not into pieces, not into fire, but into a slow, even fall of dust, every part of it letting go of every other part at the same instant, the whole bound stone of it remembering, suddenly, that it had only ever been a crowd of small things agreeing to hold together, and being told, very gently, that the agreement was over. A moon that had hung in that sky for 1 billion years became a soft gray ring of falling dust in the time it takes to draw one breath. And the human ship had not so much as raised its power above the flat, cold whisper it had carried since it arrived. Veth stood at the window with his pen in his hand and his mouth open, and on the 5 flagships, for the first time in 60,000 years of pride, there was a silence that no one had ordered and no one knew how to end. The reckoning muster had asked the Quiet One for one small, true thing, and the Quiet One had shown them that it had not been hiding a weapon at all. It had been hiding the fact that it did not think of what it carried as weapons. It thought of them as the truth, and the truth was simply that it could unmake a world without anger, the way the rest of them blinked, and that it had been standing politely at the edge of the loudest table in the Reach for 2 days, choosing, over and over, in every single second, not to. The silence over Marin Toll lasted 90 seconds, and it was the Reaver Prime who broke it, because a predator cannot live inside a silence it did not make. It snarled across the open channel that the moon trick proved nothing. A dead rock, it said. Any fool could break a dead rock with a hidden weapon and no honor. It demanded again that the Quiet One fire on something that fired back. It demanded a fight, and the Herald heard, under the snarl, the one thing a predator is never supposed to let anyone hear, the thin high note of a hunter who has just seen the shape of the thing it was hunting and understood, far too late, that the shape is wrong. But the Reaver Prime was not the first to act. The first to act was Warlord Tan Kor, because the Velthari had built their whole long history on a single sentence, and the human ship had just made the sentence a lie. The Velthari sentence was, "There is no problem that enough guns cannot solve." So Tan Kor solved the human ship. He did not announce it. He did not boast it first. He simply opened the ruin of Velt, not a tenth of it this time, not the cough that had killed a continent, but the whole of it, all 40,000 gun towers at once, 60,000 years of Velthari pride aimed in a single instant at one small gray hull at the edge of the line, and he fired everything he had. Veth saw the light coming, and put his arm across his eyes and did not look away, because a herald does not look away, and so he saw all of it. He saw 40,000 shells cross 11,000 kilometers in the dark. He saw them reach the human ship, and he saw the human ship do, to 40,000 shells, the exact thing it had done to the moon. It turned them off. There was no shield. The Herald had seen 10,000 shields in 60 years, and he knew what they looked like, the flare and the splash and the bleeding glow. This was not that. The shells simply arrived at the gray hull and stopped being shells. They came apart into the same slow, even fall of dust the moon had become. 40,000 of them, the entire fury of the largest battleship in the Karn Reach, unmade in the half-second of its arrival, drifting down into the dark as quietly as snow, and not one mote of it touched the human ship, and the human ship did not move, and its power did not rise, and when it was over, the dark gray hull sat exactly where it had sat for 2 days, unmarked, unbothered, unboastful, while the magazine of the Ruin of Velt rang empty for the first time in its history. Tankor had fired everything. The human ship had not noticed. And then the Quiet One spoke, and its voice was not angry, and that was the thing that finally broke the warlord of the Velthari. It would have been bearable if it had been angry. Anger was a thing the Reach understood. Anger meant you had heard it. But the human ship spoke the way a parent speaks to a child who has thrown a stone, with a patience so deep and so old that it left no room at all for the child's pride, and it said, "Please do not do that again." It said it had let the shells dissolve away from itself with great care so that none of the dust would fall back on the muster line and harm the other ships. It said it knew the warlord was afraid now, and that fear made creatures throw stones, and that it understood and held no grudge. It asked Tankor gently to put his guns away, and to sit with the others, and to let the Herald finish the muster in peace. The warlord who wore a melted moon as a ring, who had named a dead species after a joke, sat in his command throne aboard the largest battleship in the Reach, with his entire arsenal spent, and not a scratch on the thing he had fired it at, and for the first time in his long and terrible life, he did not know what to say, and so he said nothing, and the saying of nothing was the loudest sound the Herald had ever heard him make. Osveth wrote in the ledger. His hand was steady now. It had passed all the way through fear and come out the other side into the strange flat calm of a creature watching something so large that personal feeling no longer fits inside it. He wrote, "The Ruin of Velt fired the whole of itself." He wrote, "The guest unmade the whole of it and apologized." And then he wrote, in the wide margin, the first true sentence of the new ledger he could feel himself beginning, the ledger that would not be about boasts. "We have been measuring warships by their loudest word, and the quietest thing in the sky just spoke over all of us without raising its voice." The Osan tried next, but the Osan did not try to kill. Throne Speaker Kalis was not a fool, and the Gilded Spear had not survived as long as it had by being one. She had watched 40,000 shells become snow, and she had drawn the only conclusion a precise mind could draw, which was that force was the wrong question entirely. So she did not fire. Instead, she did the thing the Osan did best. She placed a single perfect probe, a thread of the finest sensing the Reach could build, and she touched it, with a duelist's exactness, to the surface of the human ship, not to harm it, but to read it, to find out, at last, what it was made of. The probe touched the gray hull, and the Gilded Spear, the fastest and most precise instrument in the Karn Reach, looked into the human ship for 1 full second. Then Kalis pulled the probe back and cut the channel to her own bridge, and was not heard from for an hour. When she returned, she would not say what she had seen. She never would, for the rest of her life. But the Herald, watching his own instruments, had caught the edge of it in the moment before she severed the link, the faintest backwash of what the Osan probe had touched, and it was enough. It was far more than enough. He had expected the probe to find a reactor, a core, an engine, a magazine, a heart, the things a warship is. He had expected it to find the secret of the unmaking, some hidden device, some impossible weapon folded into the dark. The probe had found a library, not a weapon, a memory, layer under layer under layer, going down and down past anything the instruments could follow. The human ship was full of names, records, accounts. The gray hull that had just unmade 40,000 shells without a flicker was, on the inside, a thing built almost entirely to remember, vast halls of remembering, and the small, terrible unmaking that the 5 powers had been so afraid of took up almost none of it. A single quiet room in an endless house of memory, the way a strong hand is mostly not for hitting. Kalis had reached into the deadliest thing in the sky, expecting to find what it could do. She had found what it would not forget. And somewhere in that hour of silence, the throne speaker of the Asan understood the same thing the herald was only beginning to write, which was that the human ship had not come to the reckoning muster as a guest at all. A guest is invited. The human ship had asked leave, but it had not needed leave. It had come the way a witness comes to a court. It had come to watch the 5 proud powers boast, and burn, and kill, and threaten, and it had written all of it down in those endless halls of memory. Every word, every crater, every dead prisoner, and every spent shell, and it would carry the account of this muster home and keep it, forever, in a place that no song could enter, and no shell could reach, and no probe could read. The 5 powers had spent 2 days performing their greatness for a thing they thought was small. They had been giving a full and honest confession to the one witness in the galaxy that could never be made to forget it. The herald set down his pen. His own ledger, the long ledger of the muster, the 60 years of boasts, suddenly felt very thin in his hands, a child's account beside the thing out there at the edge of the line. He had thought his whole life that he was the one who remembered. He had thought the herald's ledger was the memory of the Reach. And now there was a ship in the sky that was nothing but memory, all the way down, and his ledger was a single page held up beside a sea. It was somewhere in that hour, while the Asan throne sat dark and silent with the thing it had seen, that the herald did the bravest act of his own small life. He opened a channel to the human ship. He had never spoken to a warship in his life. A herald records warships. He does not address them. The boasts came to him. He did not go to the boasts. But the small gray clerk found, with his old hands shaking, that he could not write another line until he had asked the question that had been building in him for 3 days, and so he opened the band, and he spoke to the quiet one directly, herald to ship, and he asked it why. Why, he asked, did it let them? Why had it stood at the edge of the line and let the Velthari fire 40,000 shells, and the sails sing into its hull, and let the proud powers laugh and name it a small dog, when it could have ended every one of those insults in a single breath? Why did a thing so large suffer the mockery of things so small? The herald said he did not understand it, and that he had spent 60 years not understanding it, and that he would like, before he died, to understand one true thing. The human ship answered him, and its voice on the private band was warmer than it had been to any of the 5 masters, and the herald understood why. He had asked a question. The masters had only ever made statements. It said that the answer was old, and that its people had paid a terrible price to learn it. It said that a strong thing that strikes the moment it is insulted is not strong at all. It is afraid. It is so afraid of looking weak that it must answer every small thing with a large one, and that fear, that need to be seen as strong, is the exact thing that turns a great power into a belt of dust, because there is always a smaller insult to answer, and a smaller one after that, until the great power has spent its whole self answering ants. It said that real strength was the freedom not to answer. It said that the quiet one let them mock it because it did not need them to think well of it, and a thing that does not need your good opinion is the only thing in the sky you can truly trust, because it has nothing to prove and nothing to defend and no fear for you to push against. It said, I let them laugh because the laughter cannot reach me, and the only thing the laughter would buy me by striking it down is their fear, and I did not cross the dark to be feared, I crossed it to be understood. The herald wrote that down on the back page, every word, and his hand was steady, and he understood that he had just been given the answer to a question much larger than the one he had asked, the answer to the whole 60 years of his life. The Sael did not try anything. The conductor had felt its song die at the surface of the well, and the Sael, whatever else they were not stupid about silence. They had built their whole power on knowing when a thing could be made afraid, and the choir had looked into the human ship and found nothing there to frighten, and a creature that lives by fear, faced with a thing that cannot be made to feel it, does the only wise thing. It goes very still, and it hopes very hard that it is not noticed. The Dreno did not try anything either, but for a different reason. Anchor Lord Brel was old and slow, and the slow ones often see soonest. The unbroken wall had spent 2,000 years being the thing that endures, the thing that takes the blow and is still standing, and Brel had watched the human ship take 40,000 shells and remain not merely standing, but untroubled, unmarked, uninterested, and the old Dreno had understood, with the clean grief of a creature meeting its own god, that the wall's 2,000 years of pride was the pride of a thing that had simply never been hit hard enough yet. There was no shame in it. There was only the quiet of a long boast ending. Brel powered down the wall's defiance, and let the glowing scars cool, and said, on the open channel, in his slow old voice, the first humble sentence the reckoning muster had heard in 60 years. He said, "I yield the floor to the guest." The herald watched the four powers go still, one after another, and he felt the shape of the muster changing under him, like ice beginning to give. For 3 days the gathering had been a contest, with 5 proud entrants. Now 4 of the 5 had set their pride down, each in its own way, the Velthari into stunned silence, the Osan into a darkened bridge, the Sail into careful stillness, the Dreno into open humility, and the contest of boasts was simply ending, quietly, the way a fever breaks, not with a winner declared, but with everyone too tired and too changed to keep pretending. And the herald understood that the human ship had wanted exactly this, and had built every one of its 3 days toward it. It had not come to win the contest, it had come to end the contest, to make the whole loud machinery of the reckoning muster grind to a halt, and look at itself, and it had done it without firing a single shot at a single living thing. The moon, the shells, the held charge, none of it had been an attack, all of it had been an argument, made in the only language the proud could not talk their way out of, the language of a thing that could have hurt them and did not. That left the Reaver Prime. And the Reaver Prime, the Predator, the hunter of warships, the lean scarred thing with 300 names carved into its hull, did the only thing a predator has ever known how to do when the prey turns out to be larger than the world. It attacked, alone, knowing, with its eyes open. Osveth would think about that for the rest of his life, the Reaver Prime's last charge, and he would never decide whether it was the bravest thing he ever saw or the most broken. The hollow crown lit its engines and threw itself across 11,000 kilometers, straight at the human ship, every predator weapon it owned screaming, 300 kills behind it, and a clear, calm, hopeless certainty that it was about to become the 301st death and not the kill, charging anyway, because a hunter that does not hunt is already dead, and the Reaver Prime would rather end as a warship than live as a witness. And the human ship the herald saw did not unmake it. That was the moment Osveth finally understood what he was looking at. Because the unmaking was easy. The unmaking was the moon, the shells, the small quiet room in the endless house. The hard thing, the thing the human ship had been doing for 2 days with a patience that had begun to look like pain, was the not unmaking, and as the hollow crown charged at it with murder in every line, the quiet one did the hardest thing the herald had ever watched a warship do. It reached out, gently, across 11,000 kilometers, and it caught the predator, and it held it still. The hollow crown stopped in open space, with its engines screaming at full, and nothing under them to push against. The herald watched the predator ship strain. Its engines were burning hot enough to crack a planet's crust, every weapon firing, every drop of its fury pouring out, and it did not move, not a meter, not a hand's breadth, held in the empty dark as easily as a grown creature holds a struggling child at arm's length, with about as much effort and about as much malice. The quiet one had simply decided that the hollow crown would be still, and so it was still, and all the screaming in the world made no difference to that decision. The Reaver Prime fired everything it had into the held space between them, and the human ship turned every shot to dust without seeming to notice, the way you might brush rain off a sleeve while talking, and the rest of the time it just held the predator there, gently, and waited for it to be done. The herald, watching the held ship strain, found himself thinking about the 300 names carved into the hollow crown's hull. He had read those names once, long ago, in an old ledger. 300 warships, each one the proudest thing in some sky, each one certain it could not be beaten, each one hunted down and ended by the lean, scarred predator, now hanging helpless in a grip it could not see. The Reaver Prime had spent its whole life teaching other powers the lesson that there is always a bigger hunter. And the human ship was teaching the Reaver Prime the same lesson now, with the same patience the predator had shown its own 300 prey, except that the human ship had added the one thing the Reaver Prime had never once added at the end of a hunt. It had added mercy. It had added the choice. It was, the herald realized, holding the predator the way a teacher holds a striking student's wrist, firmly, without anger, until the striking stops, and then it would let go. And the difference between the human ship and the hollow crown was the whole difference between a teacher and a killer, which was simply whether you opened your hand at the end. It took the hollow crown 9 minutes to be done. 9 minutes of full fury against a thing that was barely paying attention. And at the end of it the predator's weapons ran dry, and its engines guttered, and the 300 killer hung exhausted and silent, in the grip of a hand it could not see, and the herald understood that this, too, the human ship had done on purpose. It had not stopped the Reaver Prime's charge, it had let the charge spend itself. It had let the predator empty out every last thing it had, safely, against a wall that would never break, because the human ship had judged, in its endless patient memory, that a hunter that is stopped will always wonder if it could have won, and a hunter that is allowed to try everything and fail will finally, at last, know. Then the quiet one let the hollow crown go. It did not crush it, it did not mark it, it opened its hand, simply, and the predator ship drifted free, whole, unharmed, its 300 carved names intact, its hull without a single new scratch, and the herald realized he was looking at the cruelest mercy he had ever seen, because the human ship had just told the proudest hunter in the Reach the one thing a hunter cannot survive hearing. It had told the Reaver Prime that it was not even worth marking, that the kill the predator had charged so bravely to die making had been declined, not out of weakness, but because the human ship did not collect names. It did not need the hollow crown's death the way the hollow crown needed everyone else's. It let the predator go the way you release a thing too small to keep. And the Reaver Prime, drifting free and whole and utterly undone, did the bravest thing left to it. It powered down its weapons, and it turned the hollow crown so that the 300 carved names faced the human ship, all of them, the whole graveyard it wore as armor, and it lowered itself, hull down, in the old ist gesture that a predator makes exactly once in its life and never twice, the gesture for a thing larger than the hunt. The herald wrote it down. The hollow crown bowed. He had not known, until he wrote it, that a thing like that could be written. Then the human ship spoke to all 5 powers at once, and the reckoning muster heard, for the first time in 60,000 years, a voice that did not boast, and did not threaten, and did not need to do either, and Osveth set his pen against the page, and took down every word, because he understood that he was no longer the herald of the muster. He was the scribe of the day the boasting ended. The quiet one said its name. It said it for the first time in 2 days, plainly, without weight, the way you give your name to someone you have decided to trust with it. It said it was called the Threnody of Earth, and it said that a threnody, in the tongue of its makers, was a song sung for the dead. It said it had been named that way on purpose, by the people who built it, and that the name was the whole of the answer to every boast the 5 powers had made. It told them, then, why it did not boast. It said its people had once been very much like the 5 powers of the Karn Reach. It said that long ago, before they ever left their world, humans had measured their warships by the size of the shout, by the mass and the speed, and the silence, and the wall, and the hunt, and that they had spent a great and terrible span of years doing to one another exactly what the 5 powers did to dead worlds, except that the worlds humans had practiced on were not dead, and were full of people, and the people had names. It said that humans had learned to unmake things long before they had learned to be sorry about it, and that for a while, a long and bloody while, They had been the loudest and proudest and most fearsome thing in their own small sky, and they had nearly, in their pride, turned their whole world into a belt of dust around a cold star, the very joke the Velthari had named a dead species after. It said they had stopped, in the end, not because they grew weak, but because they finally grew up. It said the loudest powers are always the young ones, the ones still proving they are real, and that the truly old powers, the ones that have already broken everything once and grieved it, do not boast, because they remember what the boast costs. It said the threnody of Earth carried, in its endless halls of memory, the name of every single being its people had ever killed in the long bloody years of their pride, all of them, kept forever, sung to in the dark, because a people that forgets the dead it made will go and make them again. That was the song. That was why the ship was a threnody. The deadliest thing humanity had ever built was, at its heart, an act of remembering the cost of being exactly what the five powers were so proud of being. It said the loud years were not a shame. It wanted the five powers to hear that clearly, because a young thing told only that it is wrong learns nothing but to hide. It said every grown power had passed through the loud years, every single one, that there had never been a wise old people in the whole long history of the galaxy that had not once been a furred slab of 40,000 guns, shouting at a dead world to prove it was real. The loud years were not the failure. The loud years were the childhood. The failure was only this, the human ship said, the one failure that turned a childhood into a belt of dust, and it was the failure to ever grow out of them, the failure of a power that reached the strength to end worlds before it reached the wisdom to mourn them, and then never closed that gap, and spent its terrible strength answering every insult and burning every neighbor and proving itself, over and over, louder and louder, until the day a quieter thing arrived that it could not shout down. It said it did not want the five powers to be ashamed of their guns. It wanted them to grow old enough to be sad about them. That was all. That was the whole difference between a power that lasts and a power that ends. Not strength, sorrow, the willingness to remember the cost, and to feel it, and to let the feeling stay your hand the next time, and the next. It said it had come to the muster not to win the contest of boasts, but because its people had a custom, a quiet one, a hard one. When a human ship found a young power still in the loud years, still measuring itself by craters, still one bad century away from the belt of dust, it would go and stand at the edge of the loudest table and let the young power boast at it and threaten it and fire on it, and it would not boast back, and it would not be afraid, and it would not strike, no matter what was done to it, and at the end it would show the young power, gently, exactly one true thing. Not so the young power would kneel. The threnody of Earth said that very clearly. It did not want them to kneel. It said it had unmade the moon and the shells and held the predator for one reason only, which was so that the five proud powers of the Karn Reach would know, beyond any doubt, beyond any need to test it ever again, that the quiet at their table had not been the quiet of weakness. It had been the quiet of a thing that could end all five of them in the time it took to draw a breath, and had chosen, in every second of 2 long days, while they killed continents to frighten it and fired their whole arsenals at it and sang their songs into its hull, not to. Because that, the threnody said, was the only lesson worth crossing the dark to teach. Anyone can be strong, the young are strong, strength is easy and loud, and it ends, sooner or later, in a belt of dust. The hard thing, the grown thing, the thing the five powers had not learned yet and the humans had nearly died learning, was to be the strongest thing in the sky and to keep your guns put away anyway, not because you cannot use them, because you remember, all the way down, in halls of memory no song can enter, what it costs every time you do. It told them one last thing before it told the herald his. It said that it had measured all five of them in those 3 days while they measured it, not with weapons, with memory. It said that the moment each battleship had spoken its boast, the threnody had reached into its endless halls and found the others like it, the warships of 100 other young powers in 100 other skies, the ones that had said exactly the same words and made exactly the same craters and ended exactly the same way. It said the ruin of Velt had spoken with the voice of 200 dead Velthari-style hulls the human ship had outlived, and the gilded spear with the voice of 100 dead needles, and that nothing the five powers had said or done at the muster was new to it. Not one boast, not one shot, not one crater, because the Threnody had been to a great many loud tables, and the loud tables were always, heartbreakingly, the same. That was the thing that finally landed on the five masters harder than the moon, harder than the held predator, harder than 40,000 shells turned to snow. It was not that the human ship was stronger than them. They could have borne being weaker. The unbearable thing was that they were not even surprising. They had spent their whole proud histories believing themselves singular, the greatest, the fiercest, the only, and a quiet gray ship had just told them, gently, without cruelty, that it had met them 1,000 times before, in 1,000 other skies, wearing 1,000 other names, and that it had come to Marin Toll already knowing how the boast would go, the way a grown creature knows how a child's tantrum will go, having had so very many children. The five powers were not unique. They were a stage of life, and the human ship had crossed the dark, not to defeat them, but to sit with them through it, the way the old sit with the young, patiently, because they remember being exactly that loud and exactly that afraid, and they remember what it cost, and they would spare the young the cost if the young would only listen. The reckoning muster was silent. Osveth, the herald, the small gray clerk who had written down 10,000 boasts in 60 years, sat with his pen still and his ledger open, and tears, he was surprised to find, running down the gray folds of his old face, because he had spent his whole life believing that the great deeds were the craters, and the boasts, and the size of the shout, and he had just been told, by a song sung for the dead, that the greatest deed he would ever record was a thing that had not happened. 2 days of a warship choosing not to fire, the largest absence in the history of the Reach, the deafening sound of restraint. He turned, slowly, to a fresh page at the very back of his ledger, the page no herald had ever used, the page kept blank for a deed too great to file among the boasts. And on it he began to write the only entry that had ever truly mattered. But the Threnody of Earth was not finished, and the last thing it said only to the herald, on a private channel, in a voice so quiet that none of the five powers heard it at all. It said it had seen him counting. It said it had watched the small gray clerk at the long window for 2 days, the only being in the whole muster who had been afraid not for himself but for the truth of the record, the only one writing down what was real instead of what was proud, and it said that it knew what a herald was, because its own people had kept heralds once, in the loud years, and had learned the hard way how precious the ones who tell it true become when the proud start to lie. It said the five powers would go home from this muster changed, or they would not, and that was their choice and not the ship's to make. But the record of what happened here, the true record, the song of the day the boasting stopped, that needed a keeper, and the Threnody had crossed the dark looking, among other things, for exactly one thing it could not build, and could not carry, and could not unmake into being. A witness who would tell it true. It asked Osveth, gently, the way it asked everything, whether he would be that witness, whether he would keep the true ledger of this day, and the next, and the ones after, and teach the young powers of the Reach the lesson the craters could not by boasting of the human ship, but by remembering it honestly, the absence and all. It said it could not make him. It said it would never make anyone do anything, that the not making was the whole of the point. It only asked. And the herald, weeping over his open ledger above a dead world ringed in the dust of a billion-year moon, understood that he had spent 60 years writing down the wrong book, and that the right one was being handed to him now by a song sung for the dead, and that the only honest answer a herald can ever give to the truth is yes. The Threnody of Earth stayed at the reckoning muster for one more day, and it spent that day doing the strangest thing of all. It cleaned up. The herald watched it from the long window, and could hardly believe what his instruments were drawing. The human ship moved out from the edge of the line for the first time in 3 days, slow and unhurried, and it went to the slow gray ring of dust that had been the moon, and it gathered the dust. Not all of it. It left the ring where the dead moon's orbit had been, the way you leave a grave marked. But the dust that had begun to drift down toward Marin Toll, the dust that would, over centuries, have rained burning across the dead world and changed it, the human ship gathered that, gently, into itself, so the cinder world below would be left exactly as it had been found. The five powers watched a thing that had unmade a moon without effort spend a whole day picking up after itself, so that nothing it had done would harm anyone later, and the herald understood that this too was the lesson, said one more time in a way no boast could ever say it. The Velthari had flattened a continent and left the wound glowing. The Osan had shattered a mountain and let the pieces fall where they would. The human ship had unmade an entire moon and then stayed an extra day to make sure not a single mote of it would ever trouble a living thing. Power was not the difference between the Threnody and the 5 battleships. The difference was who cleaned up. While the human ship gathered the dust, the 5 masters did a thing that had never once happened at a reckoning muster in 60,000 years. They spoke to one another, openly, on the common band, not to boast and not to threaten, but to ask. They asked each other what they had just seen, and the herald, listening, heard the proudest powers in the Reach fumble for words like younglings, because there were no words in any of their tongues for what the Threnody of Earth had done, and the absence of those words was itself the lesson. Their whole languages had been built to describe winning and losing and the size of the shout. Not one of them had a word for a thing that could win, and chose instead to teach. It was Kalis who finally found something close. The throne speaker of the Osan, who had looked into the human ship and seen the library and not the weapon, said, in a voice the herald had never heard her use, a voice with all the precision gone soft out of it. We have spent our whole histories building ships to be feared, and that thing out there built a ship to be trusted, and I did not know, until this hour, that the second is the harder thing to build. No one argued with her. Even Tan Kor, with his spent magazine and his bare ring finger, did not argue, and the herald understood that he was watching the first true conversation the 5 powers had ever had, the first time they had stopped performing for one another long enough to be honest, and that the human ship had given them this too, this small new thing, simply by being the one entity in the sky none of them could lie to, and none of them could frighten, and none of them needed to impress, because it had already seen the worst of them, and had not flinched, and had not struck, and had instead stayed an extra day to clean. When it was finished, the Threnody of Earth came back to the muster line one last time, and it spoke to the 5 powers in farewell, and there was no triumph in it, and that absence of triumph was the most humbling thing the Reach had ever been given. It told the Velthari that mass was a fine thing, and that one day, when they had grown old enough to grieve, they would learn that the greatest use of 40,000 guns is to have them and never need them, and to be the kind of power whose neighbors sleep soundly because the strongest hand in the sky is also the gentlest. It told the Osan that their precision was a gift, and that the most precise thing a warship could ever choose was the exact moment not to fire, and that throne speaker Kalis, who had looked into the human ship and seen the library and not the weapon, already understood this better than she would admit for many years. It told the Sail that a power built on fear is a power that has not yet met the thing it cannot frighten, and that on the day they finally did, they would have a choice, to break against it as the conductor's song had broken, or to set the fear down and learn to make a quieter kind of music, the kind that does not need anyone to be afraid. It told the Dreno that the unbroken wall had a great heart, and that Anchor Lord Brel, who had yielded the floor, had shown more strength in that one humble sentence than in 2,000 years of standing unmarked. Because the hardest blow for a wall to take is the truth that it was never really being tested, and Brel had taken it standing, and that was a thing worth remembering. And it told the Ismarauders, last of all, that the Reaver Prime was a true warrior, the truest at the muster, because only a true warrior charges a thing it knows it cannot beat, and only a great one survives the charge whole enough to bow. It said the hunt was not a small thing or an empty one. It said that one day the Is would find a worthier use for all that courage than carving names, and that when they did, The galaxy would be glad the hunters had not broken themselves first on their own pride. Then the threnody of Earth turned, slow and dark and quiet, and it left the reckoning muster the way it had come, without a banner, without a name painted on its hull, without a single shot fired in 3 days. And the 5 proudest battleships in the Karn Reach watched the deadliest thing any of them had ever seen fly away into the dark, and not one of them, the herald noticed, made a single boast as it went. The silence held for a long time after the human ship was gone. Osveth kept the true ledger, as he had promised. He kept it for the rest of his long life, and the keeping of it changed the Karn Reach more slowly and more deeply than any war ever had. He did not write the human ship into the old book of boasts. The threnody had asked him not to, and he understood why. A boast is a thing that demands to be answered, that asks the next power to fire back, to top it, to prove itself. If the herald had written the human ship into the ledger as the greatest warship ever seen, he would only have lit a fire under 60,000 years of pride, sent the 5 powers racing to build something that could turn off moons, and the racing would have ended exactly where the human ship said all such races end, in a belt of dust around a cold star. So instead he wrote the true ledger, the back-page ledger, the one that was not about deeds at all. He wrote down the absence. He wrote down the 2 days a warship was fired upon and did not fire back. He wrote down the moon gathered up so it would harm no one. He wrote down the predator held gently and let go whole. He wrote down a name that meant a song sung for the dead, and the reason a grown power keeps such a name, and the lesson that the loudest thing in any sky is always the youngest, and the proof that the truly old powers are quiet, not because they are weak, but because they remember. And then he did the thing the threnody had really asked of him. He taught it. He brought the true ledger to the young of the 5 powers, the small ones, the ones still learning what greatness was. He read it to Velthari younglings who had been raised to believe that a great warship was a furred slab of 40,000 guns, and he watched their faces change when they understood that the greatest warship in the story never fired one. He read it to Osan students who had been taught that the perfect shot was the highest art, and he taught them the harder art, the perfect restraint. He carried it to the Sael and the Dreno, and even in time to the Is, who listened to the story of the bow with a stillness that the herald had never seen in a predator before, and at the end of which the youngest of them asked, quietly, whether it was true that a warship could decline a kill, and the herald said yes, and the young hunter sat with that for a long time, and the herald thought, watching, that he had just seen the first crack in 60,000 years of carving names. The reckoning muster still happened, every 40 years, but it changed, slowly, over a long time, longer than the herald's own life. It became a different gathering. The killing of dead worlds fell out of fashion first, then the contest of craters, then, last and hardest, the boasting itself. The 5 powers did not become weak. The herald wanted to be very clear about that, in the true ledger, because he knew the young would worry about it. The Velthari still built the largest hulls in the Reach. The Osan still placed the finest shots. The Dreno still could not be broken. But they began, slowly, generation by generation, to measure their warships by a different question than the size of the shout. They began to ask what the ship was for, and they began, more and more, to build ships that remembered things, ships with halls of memory in them, ships that carried the names of the dead so that the living would think twice, and a few of the wisest among the young even began, here and there, to call their finest warships by quiet names, names that meant a song, or a grave, or a debt remembered. None of them ever turned off a moon. The herald suspected none of them ever would. He suspected, in the deep place under his counting, that the threnody of Earth had not been showing them a thing they could build, but a thing they could become, which was a power old enough, and grieved enough, and grown enough, to be the strongest hand in the sky, and never once need to close it. The 5 masters of that first, changed muster lived out their days differently for having been there. Warlord Tankor never wore the slag ring again. He took it off the night the human ship left, and he never put it back on, and when he died, old and quiet, in a bed instead of a battle, The last thing he was heard to say was that he had spent his whole life proud of the wrong moon. The continent he had flattened to frighten a guest stayed glowing for 100 years, and he ordered, near the end, that it be left exactly as it was, and that the young Velthari be brought to look at it, not as a boast, but as a question. Throne Speaker Kalis never told anyone what the probe had shown her inside the human ship. But she changed the Osan throne's whole philosophy of the perfect shot, and the change she made was a single new rule, taught to every Osan gunner from that day on, that the most perfect shot a warship can ever take is the one it chooses not to. They called it, in the Osan tongue, the Kalis restraint, and it outlived her by 1,000 years. The conductor of the sail disbanded the choir's deepest songs, the ones that opened airlocks, the ones that made the cold dark look like a mother. It could not say why, even to itself, except that it had touched a hull once that the fear could not enter, and had understood, in that touching, that a power built only to frighten is a power waiting its whole life to meet the thing that ends it, and the conductor had decided it would rather not spend the rest of its days waiting. Anchor Lord Brel died first of the 5, old and slow and content, and his last order to the Dreno was that the unbroken wall be retired, not scrapped, not destroyed, but parked in honor above the Dreno homeworld, with a single line carved into its endless armor, the line the human ship had taught him without ever meaning to. The line read, "I was never really tested, and that was my whole strength, and I am glad of it." And the Reaver Prime, the Predator, the hunter who bowed, did the strangest thing of any of them. It stopped carving names. The 300 kills it had made stayed on the Hollow Crown's hull, because the dead deserved to be remembered too, but it never added a 301st, and when the young Is asked it why, the Reaver Prime said only that it had finally met a warship worth more than its death, and that once you have seen a thing decline to kill you, the kill stops looking like the largest thing in the sky. The Hollow Crown spent the rest of its long hunting life finding young powers in the loud years and standing at the edge of their loud tables, and not boasting, and not striking, and showing them, gently, exactly one true thing. It had learned the human custom. It had become, in its scarred and ruined way, a herald of its own. Osveth outlived them all, the way the ones who only watch so often do. He was very old when the end came for him, old enough that the true ledger had grown into many ledgers, and the keeping of them had passed to younger hands he had trained himself, hands that knew how to write down an absence, how to record the deeds that did not happen, how to teach the young that the loudest sky is the most dangerous one. He had made the keeping of the true record into a calling, an order, a quiet gray line of clerks across the whole Karn reach, whose work was not to celebrate the proud, but to remember the cost, and to carry, from young power to young power, the story of the day, a song sung for the dead, came to the loudest table in the reach and won everything by firing nothing. On the last night of his life, the herald asked to be brought to the long window of the pavilion deck, where it had all begun, and they brought him, and he looked out at the dead world of Marin Toll, still ringed in the slow gray dust of the moon that the human ship had taken apart and never quite let fall. He thought about the threnody of Earth. He wondered, the way he had wondered every day for the rest of his life, where it had gone, and whether it was even now standing at the edge of some other loud young power's table, on the far side of the dark, letting itself be fired upon and singing, quietly, to its endless halls of the remembered dead. He hoped that it was. He hoped there were many of them, a whole quiet gray fleet of songs sung for the dead, moving from sky to sky, never boasting, never striking, growing the galaxy up one frightened young power at a time, with a patience that was almost kind, and was, the herald had finally decided, the kindest thing there was. He had spent 60 years before that day believing that the great deeds were the craters. He had spent the rest of his life knowing better. The greatest thing he had ever recorded was a warship that came to the loudest gathering in the Reach, was mocked and threatened and fired upon by the 5 proudest powers in the sky, and answered every single one of them, for 3 long days, with the one weapon none of them had ever thought to build. It refused, gently, to do them any harm, and the herald, looking out at the dust of a dead moon above a healed world, understood at the very end that this was the whole of the lesson, the only lesson that had ever mattered, the one his order would carry from sky to sky, long after his counting hands were still. The 5 aliens had boasted about their battleships. They had measured greatness by the size of the shout, by mass and speed and silence, and the unbroken wall and the hunt, and they had been so sure, so loud, so proud, until they witnessed ours. And ours had not been the loudest thing in the sky. Ours had not been the largest, or the fastest, or the most armored, or the most fearsome. Ours had been the quietest. Ours had carried, in halls no song could enter, the names of every being it had ever cost the galaxy to learn this lesson the hard way. Ours had stood at the edge of their table and let them mock it, and threaten it, and empty their whole arsenals against it, and had answered all of it with a patience so vast, and so grieved, and so grown, that the 5 proudest powers in the Reach had looked at it and finally understood what greatness was. Greatness was not the shout. Greatness was the thing strong enough to keep its guns put away, and old enough to want to, and kind enough to cross the whole dark sky to teach a frightened young power that it could choose to be that too, before it ever became a belt of dust around a cold star. The herald closed his eyes for the last time with the true ledger open on his lap, and the last line on the last page, written years before in his own steadiest hand, read only this: "It came to the loudest table in the sky, and it did not raise its voice, and that was how we finally heard it."